Wanted to take a look at this essay by Spinden, The Enigma of Engineering's Industrial Exemption to Licensure, the exception that swallowed a profession. Is that what it's called? This is a long essay, which has been a deterrent, I'm sure, and especially with the wide-ranging historical part, it can be perhaps difficult to find what the actual argument is. But that's fairly easy, actually, once you have, if you read the introduction where he, gives a précis, a little summary of the different sections and what he's doing, it's clear that he's arguing a major overall point, and that is that the industrial exemption to licensure is a bad thing and should be eliminated. And then the question is, why, right? What would that do? Why is the exemption bad? And what good would eliminating it do? But if we look, at the different sort of wide-ranging survey or argument that he has here, it returns us to some familiar subjects that we've been looking at, perhaps in a number of different texts, especially Thomas Templin's essay on the fourth canon. And if you look at this paragraph on page 679, it should be reminiscent for you of some, what Templin was laying out at the beginning of his essay on the fourth canon. And the issue really does seem to me to boil down to control. And this is in the paragraph here that begins the industrial exemption. He says the industrial exemption's perversion is that in lifting responsibility from the engineer's shoulders and putting it on management, it necessarily gives management claim of control over the engineering work. The untenable result is that a person who may or may not understand engineering has control over engineering work, what the work is to be and who is to perform it. Under the exemption, management is free to assign engineering work to any of its employees, even those not trained in engineering, and it is free to accord the title engineer to any employee without consideration of the employee's credentials. An engineer having earned a graduate degree may occupy a cubicle next to a person who, although titled engineer, has not attained even a bachelor's degree. The important thing there, I think, is this difficult position that an employed engineer is in that the people who have the real control, management, may be people who don't understand the engineering issues that are at stake in any particular project. One of the things that Templin pointed out is that professional work requires a high degree of autonomy and discretionary decision-making. That is an essential aspect of being a professional in general, but being an employed person, being an employee, seems to take away that autonomy and that decision-making. The whole idea, one of the rock bottom idea of being professional is that you as a professional have knowledge and skills that others don't have. That is your main claim. Maybe your only claim to being a professional is that there is that knowledge gives you a special status. But being an employee it takes away your control over how that knowledge is used. So that others who aren't in a position to understand what's actually going on are in the decision-making roles, and you are in a subservient role. That seems to be really, if you think about the essay as a whole, that seems to be the basic issue, is control over engineering work. Without such control, Spinden pretty much says that engineering can't really be considered a profession if the engineers themselves don't have control over the work. And it kind of puts us in the position of reading the first page or so of Templin's essay and saying, well, I guess engineering isn't a profession, right? That is, if the reality is that 80% or whatever of engineers are actually employed engineers, maybe more, I don't know. And if being an employee disqualifies you from actually being a professional, then engineering should probably give up its pretensions to being a profession. Of course, Templin argues that it's possible to be both, and I think that Spinden probably does too. It really must, because he recognizes that the situation is not going to change overnight. I mean, it's not, engineers won't suddenly be, the majority of engineers won't suddenly be independent contractors or free agents or people who have control over their work in the traditional way. Yeah, I'm sorry for the interruption. Got a phone call. I'm trying to remember where I was. I think we're talking about this issue of control in this paragraph on page 679, the perversion of the industrial exemption. It really does go down to that issue of engineers being managed by, giving up autonomy to people who are non-engineers. And I think that is the perversion, is that the using of the skills is divorced from the control of the skills, which would seem to undermine the very idea of being a professional, which requires that kind of autonomy and control. Right. Templin believes that the situation can be made better by an adjustment to the fourth canon, which emphasizes a critical loyalty, emphasizes the idea that engineers do need to be faithful agents of their clients, and they also need to be loyal to their employers, but that has a limit in any loyalty that would require them to violate any aspect of their professional code, their professional responsibility. An attempt to ease the tension, you might say. The main point of this long essay by Spinden is to argue that the industrial exemption should be eliminated. But of course, he has to give us some reasons for thinking that would do any good, that would better the situation, that it would both improve the status of the profession of engineering, but more importantly, that it would protect the public. And essentially, that means, I suppose, for us, that it would allow and encourage engineers to better follow the first canon. So, what good would it do? One of the really interesting expressions that Spinden borrows from a court case is this idea of the brooding omnipresence. Of course, I won't be able to find it, but I'll try. So actually, up higher, the idea of the brooding omnipresence, which is from a court case. It was used in a different context in the court case where some famous justice said that the law was not a brooding omnipresence. But Spinden is suggesting that licensure could be a positive brooding omnipresence. That is, I can find it. Let me pause. I'm going to pause for a second here again. Find it. I found it. He uses the term on page 674 in the section, "What difference would a license have made?" And he has just told the story, the oft-told story of the Challenger disaster, and basically told the story of the engineers caving in, or one particular engineer caving in to corporate and governmental pressure to do something which, in his engineering judgment, he thought was unsound, but was asked infamously to take off his engineering hat and put on his manager's hat. which is by many pointed to as the emblematic of the mistake. You can't do that as an engineer. So on page 674, Spinden says, during such times as Roger Boisjoli faced, about the most significant effect a professional license can have is to serve as an outside influence, a reminder to the professional that his or her duties extend far beyond his or her employer's interests, to include the public interest. It serves as a sort of brooding omnipresence to prick the professional's conscience during such ethical dilemmas, such as Boisjoli and other Thiokol engineers faced. It is what Martin Goland had in mind when he admonished that for an engineer to, quote, use his professional talents in a cause he believes to be unworthy is a violation of a sacred social trust. And finally, he says a license surely would not have made Boisjoli more zealous and passionate that night in Brigham City. Even without a license, he seemed to be spurred by a brooding omnipresence from another source, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is that if you have a license, if you've had to actually been certified, and you have to have a license to practice, that license is a reminder. The brooding omnipresence is like, it's not like you have your license in your hand your whole time looking at it, but it's in the background that you are a licensed professional. And that is a reminder that you have obligations which are deeper than your obligations to your employer. That your license is a symbol of and a reminder of your professional status. Again, if we think of what Templin said about different employees, that there were local employees and cosmopolitan employees. The license, being a licensed professional, is a reminder that you have to be a cosmopolitan rather than a local employee, meaning that your ultimate allegiance cannot be to the company, it's to the profession and to the things that the profession is obligated to, and that is, in the case of engineers, the first canon, the obligation to the public. Now, you should take a look at the arguments for and against here, the industrial exemption. First of all, you should understand the industrial exemption. You should understand what I did. I didn't really know until I taught this course for a long time, that engineers do need to be licensed. All engineers need to be licensed in every state, but then the exemptions kick in, so that even though there is a general law that all engineers need to be licensed to be professional engineers, that is, there are these exemptions which are listed in the beginning. The exemption if you work for a licensed engineer, the exemption if you work for a public utility, the exemption that if you work for the federal government or a state government, and finally the biggest exemption if you work for an industrial firm of some sort, or if you work for a large business, the industrial exemption, which is the one that's being targeted here. You should know that, right? That you, if you don't become a PE as an engineer, you operate under an exemption to licensure. That is, you're operating under an exception. State governments have almost unanimously, I guess, decided is a good idea. The main argument that he gives, for defending the exemption. Let's see if I can find that too. It's earlier. I'll pause again. Yeah, that argument is here in around page 666, 665. This Kohlhoff, M.J. Kohlhoff, page 664, section A of this, subsection A of this section of the essay. Kohlhoff argues that the industrial exemption is necessary as a delimiter, and that delimiter is of government interference, overregulation. That if employed engineers who work for companies like Ford or Microsoft or Apple, whatever, were required to be licensed, that would be government overreach. Because there's no there's no need to license such engineers, because first of all, they're doing what is called ancillary, if I can find that word, ancillary engineering work, which means that engineering work which is secondary to the major thing going on, right? If you're selling a car, you have to employ engineers, but you're not selling engineering. You're not selling engineering work to the public like an engineering firm, where you're selling a car, and engineering is ancillary to the production of that car. It's something that is a secondary thing, um, something that's supplementary or in the background, you might say. So it's not engineering work that directly affects the public, is I suppose the argument. The second argument is that, and we don't need to license such engineers, because licensing is really a matter of forcing the professional to take responsibility for their work. But the firms themselves, the businesses themselves, the corporations themselves are taking that that responsibility for their employees' work. So it would be redundant to then require the employee to be licensed. And finally, the Kohlhoff, says that the protection is ultimately the courts, right? I mean, that is that tort law, wrong law, civil law. I mean, lawsuits like the Ford Pinto lawsuit, for instance. That those things are protections of the public against irresponsible engineering, because the companies themselves would be held liable. Spinden rejects all of those points. The ancillary engineering point, he thinks, is simply a wrong distinction. That is that you can't in practice really distinguish between engineering that's secondary and engineering that's primary. Engineering is engineering. Engineering is needed to design products, and those products are going to be used by people. And moreover, the exemptions are vague about the distinction, so it's not even clear that there's any sort of engineering that a non-licensed engineer can't do. So, and the thing about the torts, the thing about the court, the liability argument is that that's closing the barn door after the cow leaves. That regulation should protect people from being harmed. It shouldn't be the kind of thing that compensates them after they're harmed. So the exemption does not. It leaves a situation in which the public is not really protected, because they can be compensated for being harmed by bad engineering. But the idea is to prevent bad engineering in the first place, and that brings us back, I think, to the brooding omnipresence idea. What good would licensing do? Well, maybe his argument is not really that strong, I think, in terms of arguing that there would be a real practical effect of engineering, but it generally claims that it would, if we required licensing of all engineers, that it would tip the balance back in control towards engineers themselves and away from corporations. That it would to some extent reassert, or maybe assert for the first time, the professional control of engineers over their own work, and thereby protecting the public, because it would reinforce the idea of engineers as professionals with obligations primarily to the public that are stronger than whatever obligations they have as employees. Basically, in a way similar to Templin's essay, arguing that it would it would make them into something like the cosmopolitan employees that are described in that essay, who display loyalty to their company, but critical loyalty. And the critical loyalty is the presence of the professional code of ethics that supersedes whatever loyalty the employed engineer may have to